this feast of St. Elizabeth of Hungary could pass us by rather unexpectedly without drawing our attention, but it actually is worth pausing over, as are the readings that we have just heard. She was of royal stock, and already as a child was given in potential betrothal to a nobleman of value, Ludwig, Landgrave of Thuringia, and they eventually married when she came of age and had a happy time together in the ambit of faith. They had 3 children already by the time that her good husband offered to volunteer for service in the crusade, but before getting to the Holy Land met his own death, which then was an impetus to this already holy woman to give her all to Jesus and to follow him like St. Francis, whose figure had enchanted her, naked to follow the naked Christ. Indeed, already when she was still married and responsible, she would be extremely kind to the most suffering and helpless that she would meet. A poor leper one time crossed her path, and not only did she serve him, but she took him in and put him in a bed and looked after him. Indeed, it was a posh bed, that of her own husband, and he was not expected to return so quickly. He accidentally came back without warning and found this gentleman there where he should be, and he was not amused. And the Lord himself intervened by giving him a revelation, a vision of some kind, and he saw suddenly Christ in the poor leper. And then he was given a grace to enter into the vision of his holy wife and to have something of her grace, which then became formally orientated by the giving of herself totally to Christ as a Franciscan tertiary after her widowhood, and the clothing then in the grey habit of those ladies. All that she had, and she had things, property and money, eventually went to the poor, and she founded a hospice in the chateau which she had in her possession, and went first thing in the morning and last thing at night herself to serve, to nurse, to wash, to care for, and in general, as we would say nowadays, to give TLC to those who in those days had little else before they died. And she was also known to have mystic communications or experiences with the Lord himself. Remember that this Franciscan movement was very much orientated towards relationship with Christ in his humanity. That also explains the great attachment that they had to the holy places, and they are there to this day as custodians. Anyway, one day, with one of her closest companions, they were coming out of this hospice founded by herself, and she all of a sudden was seen to be like Moses, shining in her face, with fire as it were coming from her eyes, and her companion said to her, "Mother, hide your face, you are shining." And her reaction was, "We have truly met Christ today." And she was referring to the poor people, lepers and all, that they had been washing and touching as the priest would at the altar, rather like, much later in time, our own Blessed Mother Teresa. This I would hand on to you, because Christ is coming to us in unexpected forms. Indeed, one day when in a monastery in Italy, by the way, we have one of our brethren there with us, staying with me on retreat this week, but we were one day hearing confessions and all the rest of it, and people would come and go. And I came across this lady whose name I've completely forgotten. I remember that she was a doctor, and therefore she knew what she was talking about. And she had had something of this compassion of Christ in an unexpected situation. Somebody wanting a lift, nothing more, and she took him into the car. But then she realized why he was finding it so difficult to have any contact with people or any lift at all. There was something seriously wrong. She, as a doctor, knew what it was. One part of his face, about half of it when he turned round, was, and she used the correct word, necrotic. That means it's putrid and it would be behaving as it would after death. He was obviously cancerous. The last person that a person would want to come close to and draw into a car. The details escape me, but I remember this, that eventually she deposed him at where he wanted to go, then got back into the car, and she was knocked for 6. The whole car was filled with a miraculous odour of incense and roses, the kind that you come across with Padre Pio. So she understood that something similar had happened in her life at that point. The Lord had taken as done unto him that taking in of the most rejected of humanity. One day I came across something which rather upset my soul. It was something that was going around, and it was what had happened in somewhere in the States. You could actually visit it on YouTube. It's there for all to see. But I came across it initially in written form, printed out. And it was a good lady, actually fairly young, who was at Holy Mass somewhere in the States, and she was very reverent at this, as at every celebration that she would be at, and would receive Holy Communion kneeling, or at least in one knee, and on the tongue. She was going to do so as would be the case normally, without thinking anything about it. And she then made the genuflection, which one is actually invited to make, because John Paul II, and it's already in the instructions anyway, did indicate that if one is receiving standing, one should make an act of reverence, physical reverence, before, that is, either a profound bow or a genuflection. If one is receiving it kneeling, that is that act already. But there is also the compromise solution where one actually makes that genuflection at the moment there of being before the priest and stays down on that one knee. It's not a big deal. Normally it doesn't make an awful lot of difference. But anyway, this lady did that, and what was her surprise when the celebrant was actually none less than the local bishop, would not give her communion in that position and was getting her to stand up. She was quite taken aback and just quietly said, "But why, my lord?" And he started to become quite aggressive, and eventually started, and you can actually see it happening, to pull her up by brute force. And also we have, in the written form of it, the testimony that she actually gave, some of the exchange that was going on there. "You are making a scene," he would say. And it was actually drawing attention to those around her, including a little girl close in First Holy Communion dress. Now, what hit me there was the way in which the Lord, in negative in that case, would have been present both in the host and also, squarely in the bishop himself as high priest, but also in this person. And one cannot in any way be adoring the Lord Jesus Christ present sacramentally and at the same time dishonouring, therefore disadoring, that presence of Christ in the person physically before me. It just doesn't make logical sense. It's the same act, one positive and one negative. One cannot please and displease the same Lord. It just doesn't make sense. And there's a lot of that going on quite often in his name in the church. People, for some perfect ideological reason, are hurting, other souls in whom Christ is living for the sake of honouring that same Christ and think they're glorifying God. It's the same kind of thing as what's actually going on in certain places in this planet right now, where Allah is being honoured by things which are abhorrent to him. It shows how people cannot see beyond the tip of their nose and certainly cannot reason with their minds. I wonder whether the Prophet Muhammad had actually the power and authority to promise immediate paradise to someone who took pleasure in chopping off a person's head, a person in whom the Lord also lives. There's something logically wrong. Let's get this straight. The conscience cannot be avoided. People can somehow dull it, even with ideology, but it still somehow is there, and deep down they know it. And there are quite a few YouTubes around of people who have been involved in this or that in Islam and have been told, either through the voice of conscience or even directly by Christ himself in vision or dream, that he was the one. I leave it with you, my friends, but it applies unto us also. Don't raise your voice and upset Christ in the person right next to you in some false notion that you are pleasing to Christ by doing so.